economic growth. And half of the fossil fuels ever burned by humans, would anyone like to guess what year that has happened since? Which year have we burned half of all of the hydrocarbons ever burned by humans? It's too hard to guess. At the moment it's 1995. So since 1995 we've burned half the fossil fuels ever burned by humans. So that's been, it's been most of our lives. It's a stunning thing, stunning realisation. So we've faced various existential threats. We understand what an existential threat is. So whether it's nuclear weapons or artificial intelligence, earthquakes, or some form of biological agents, biological terrorism, these are all existential threats. But part of the reason I'm here is that I think there is a greater existential threat, which is actually us in many ways. And the discussion about climate change and species extinction that discussion is being had beautifully right now by Extinction Rebellion. And I don't speak about climate change in my presentations because, not because I don't believe that humans are causing climate change, but I'm aware that what's happening right now is we're having a polarisation of the community. The people who believe climate change is real and we have to have 100% renewables on this pole, and the people who absolutely deny that humans are causing any problems and we need to get burning fossil fuels on this pole. And that polarisation is becoming intense right now. So my way of managing that is to engage people at the level of other existential threats. So you don't have that barbecue stopper conversation where you can no longer proceed with the conversation because people are just at odds. Has anyone had that with friends or family? It's really challenging. So my way of having that conversation is to not have that conversation, to have a conversation about other dimensions of our lives. And of course, species extinction is one that you could reasonably have a conversation about. That, well, most people know that if you drove for 3 hours in the countryside, 20 years ago, almost any time of the year, you'd have bugs on your windscreen. Drive for 3 hours in the countryside now, you're lucky if you get a bug on your windscreen. Something profound is happening to flying insects. You can have that conversation with people, and the bees are experiencing this colony collapse disorder, and these things are everyone has a sense of. So we can have that discussion. It doesn't have to include climate change. Of course, we know it's related to climate change, but we don't have to engage people on that level. So it's just another way of having the discussion. And the polarisation that's happening, I think, is probably the biggest threat that we have, and it's become very real with Greta Thunberg, or Greta Thunberg, otherwise known as, because she has become a polarising figure. And you might not recognise it if you live in a kind of a bubble where most of your friends and family can talk about climate change and it's not a problem. You probably don't realise it, but in most communities this is a really polarising thing. And whilst that polarisation is just a barbecue conversation, it really doesn't matter. You can just take it or leave it. It's climate change is a kind of abstract thing. it might or might not affect us. It might be causing bushfires at the moment or not. You know, I mean, so, but as soon as the conversation, the polarisation becomes something that affects people's lives, affects their capacity to pay their mortgage, affects their capacity to feed their children, then that polarising effect is pathological. It's a serious problem, and it's emerging right now in Europe. I mean, partly the Brexit conversation is around that many people are struggling to feed their children. You know, their experience of prosperity has declined dramatically in the last 10 years. And in France, it's emerged as the Yellow Vest, the Gilets Jaunes protesters, and they've been protesting for almost a year, every weekend. You don't hear about it in the mainstream media here. Occasionally I might get a mention, but in France it's a major issue. And the reason it's polarising there, and what it might mean for us in terms of the polarisation, is that the people who can't feed their children because they can't drive to work, because the cost of diesel has escalated. Cost of diesel has escalated because the Greens encouraged the Macron government to bring in a tax on diesel to help them meet their COP21 target, their carbon emissions target. So that was their way of reducing CO2 emissions, was to increase the price of diesel so people wouldn't drive as much. And the people who live on the very outskirts of the major cities that have to drive a long way to work can no longer drive to work, so they no longer have an income, they can't feed their families. And I saw, watching one of these protesters on YouTube, the woman was interviewed and she said, the Greenies want us to save the earth. I don't even know if I can feed my children next week. So it's like, all of a sudden, there's this serious polarisation happening. And the polarisation is happening, or the polarising effect is happening in the economic world because of the vast inequality, the vast disparity in wealth. And partly that disparity in wealth has occurred because the people who have had the capital have had the benefit of vast flows of new money into the economy. Since the global financial crisis, $150 trillion worth of new money has flowed through the banks, through Wall Street, and into the hands of I hate using the term, but the elites, the 1% of people who have the capital, have been able to get their hands on that money before anyone else. It's called the Cantillon effect. It's a known phenomenon. And so we're at the point now where we've got $244 trillion. It's now $250 trillion, I read on the ABC just recently. I read an article about it. So it's $250 trillion worth of debt. And this debt almost didn't exist when I was a child. It was just virtually non-existent as debt. And what the $244 trillion worth of debt means is $244 trillion worth of claims on the output of the economy in the future. That's what debt means. It's a claim on future energy. So if you've got money in your pocket or use your credit card and you go to the supermarket and buy food, you're exchanging money for energy. Fill up your car, you're exchanging money for energy. Money is a token for energy. And debt is a token, or rather it's a claim on future energy. So where is the energy going to come from to create the economic activity, to create enough profit to pay down $250 trillion worth of debt? It clearly can't happen. We're already pressing against a whole range of ecological and energy limits. So that was profound. So just so we know what $1 trillion looks like, that's what $1 million looks like. You could put it in your, in your backpack, walk around with it. That's $1 million. $100 million fits nicely on a standard pallet. $1 billion, 10 pallets. $1 trillion, that's our little guy there, and those pallets are double stacked. It's just, you just cannot get your head around this amount of debt that we have to pay. The other way of looking at it for people who are a bit more mathematically inclined, if you imagine dollars as seconds, 1 million seconds is 12 days. That kind of makes sense, doesn't it? It's unbelievable. 1 billion seconds is 32 years.
Oh.
1 trillion seconds is 32,000 years. This is madness. This is complete madness.
What does that look like when it just, there's too much?
We just saw it. No.
No.
What does it look like?
How many pallets?
That's right.
But like, have 300 trillion, like, what is it? Is that just where the collapse event goes down?
So do you mean how does it play out, Lockie?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tell me, Phil.
Yeah, well, we'll get to that, but the interesting thing though is how do you get $250 trillion worth of debt? Well, if you imagine it's these greenbacks, this is a household. So in 1970, the household could create this income, but it would have to take on a debt, a mortgage, a loan for a car, all of that stuff. Or if you were a business, you could create that much income, but you'd have to borrow money to build a new factory or for a farmer to buy a tractor or whatever. So that makes sense, kind of, doesn't it? I mean, it's kind of sustainable. But you get to the 1980s and you've got $2 of debt for every dollar of GDP. Get to here now where we're actually at about $5, $5.50, nearly $6 of new debt for every dollar of GDP. That's how you get $250 trillion worth of debt. You spend more than you earn for 50 years. So that's what we've been doing. Pretty stunning. And this is the actual data behind, I mean, that's a bit of a Mickey Mouse slide, that last one, but this is actually from the Federal Reserve Economic Database, and it shows exactly the same thing over time. This is US. Globally, it's very close to the same, and of course, it's very close to the same here in Australia. And how that's worked, the new money coming into our economy mainly comes into our economy as mortgages. It's the biggest spend we make in our lives, is borrow money for a house. So this is mortgage debt to GDP. In other words, it's how much debt we have compared with how much income we have, starting at 1860. And look, there was a property boom in 1890. Look at that. We had a depression in the 1890s, roaring 20s here. Baby boom, World War I, things slowed down. We got to deregulation of the banking system, which happened here in the early 90s. That was Paul Keating's genius thing. I mean, it was going to happen anyway, but he just happened to be the treasurer. And look what happened to our mortgage debt. Just since 1990, this has happened. A bit of a slowdown at the GFC, but not really much difference. Just a bit of a hiccup. The tragedy of it, though, is this mortgage debt is emerging as kitchen table conversations across the country. There are now 1.5 million households in mortgage stress right now. So these are people for whom it's not certain that they'll be able to pay their mortgage at the end of the month. So really this is the human cost of debt-fueled growth, all of that growth that we saw. And I just think, yeah, it's where the conversation about climate change and economic growth and those greenies just want to stop the economy, or how we're going to pay our mortgage, well, you know, it's their fault. So this process of othering, calling people other, and saying that other people are causing my suffering is profound when you look at this phenomenon. So really, why is this happening? Economists have got no idea why this is happening. This is stunning to me. This article was in The Guardian. University economics teaching isn't an education, it's a £9,000 lobotomy. Isn't that great? And this young guy here went to Manchester University to learn economics because his family lost their business, they lost their house, they lost everything in the global financial crisis. So he decided when it was time to choose a university degree course, he would study economics so he could find out what happened. Why did we have the global financial crisis? In 4 years, it was mentioned twice. And whenever he asked his lecturers about the global financial crisis, they would say, go and see the sociology department. It's nothing to do with economics. What? And so after he graduated, he started what he calls the post-crash economic society, where he's got, you know, disenchanted economic students together and saying, well, this is bullshit, what we've been taught. It bears no relationship to reality, what economists have been taught. And this is profound because economists are the people who advise government policymakers. So when we see government making decisions about the economy, it's like really they're looking through a kind of fog. They can't really see what's happening on the ground because they're listening to economists who don't understand. And the reason they don't understand is because their economic models don't include energy. They don't include debt. They don't include the natural world, forests, fisheries, any of that. The assumption is that that will just keep bringing forth whatever the market needs, and supply and demand will always operate, and don't need to worry about the resources. If the resource becomes scarce, the price will go up, and companies will invest and bring the resource forth. That's how they're taught. I've been influenced by this man, by a man called Dr. Tim Morgan, who was the head of research at the world's largest interbroker energy and finance company. It's called Taleb Brevan. They've got offices all over the world. And after he wrote this publication called The Perfect Storm: Energy, Finance and the End of Growth, and he was so struck by what he found in his research, he decided to leave business altogether and just become pretty much an activist, and educate the public about why this is happening. And his finding was really that of the economic students, that because they don't include energy in their economic models, they can't see why the economy's stopped growing. And the relationship between this problem, that is the energy problem as it relates to economics, is that we've had cheap energy since the 1930s, and cheap energy finished in about the mid-80s. The cost of energy, all hydrocarbons, gas, oil, coal, started to escalate, and the economy stopped growing because the rising cost of energy undermined economic growth. So the response to that was, well, if we aren't making enough profits from business now because of energy costs, how are we going to get consumers to keep consuming? We'll deregulate the banking system so that we can loan more and more money to keep the economy going. So that's the other side of the debt story. When there's not enough cheap energy, you have to create debt to keep the economy growing. You keep creating debt until there's so much debt that the interest on that debt becomes unpayable, or that people they certainly can't pay the principal, but now they can't even pay the interest because there's so much debt. So what you do then is you drive interest rates as low as you can, and interest rates at global financial crisis in Australia, so 2009, were 7%. They're now 0.7%. And that's happened globally. There are countries that have negative interest rates. In Sweden, you can get a mortgage and the bank will pay you every month to have that mortgage. That's what happens with negative interest rates. So I'll actually just stop there for a sec because I've gone through a lot of stuff, and it's now 7:28. What questions are there? What kind of went, whoa, what was that? In terms of what I've explained here. Is there anything you'd like me to go over or refresh? And we'll cover some of this in more detail in subsequent weeks. So if you're willing to just abide, that's fine. But if you have any burning questions.
Yeah, I was just wondering when you were showing the graph for the mortgage debt in Australia, I was wondering how it compares to America.
Yeah, good question. We are the world champions at that very metric of debt, mortgage debt to GDP.
Mm-hmm.
It's between us and Switzerland, actually.
Oh, so we're good.
Big buddy.
So we're good.
Yeah, we have more debt. No, we have more debt.
Worse.
Oh, well, that's what I was
We're
thinking.
worse. yeah, that's right. No, we have more debt per dollar of income than any country in the world. More housing debt, beg your pardon. So we've got a big correction coming at some point, and that's partly why we need to be making plans now to manage whatever that's going to look like. HSBC is a major international bank, and this article is really saying that the authorities have run out of ammunition. What they mean by ammunition is that ammunition, typically when the economy slows down, the central banks have two levers to pull. One is the interest rate lever, and the other one is the money printing lever. Both those levers right now are hard against the stops. You know, we're printing globally about $150 billion a month of new debt. Interest rates are at record lows. There's no historical precedent for where we are in this story. And so this is the part of this graph shows why the energy and the economy are so tightly related. Why the economists can't see what's happening is the correlation between GDP growth or economic activity, let's call it economic activity, and energy are absolute. The relationship is almost absolute correlation. So there's no escaping that. I mean, renewables are great, but they're such a tiny part of what we're doing at the moment, then that's they're not going to be a big factor for a while. And so our industrial civilization really does absolutely depend, everything, all the food that turns up in our supermarkets, petrol at the service stations, everything that we depend on is really a product of petroleum. If you say, well, the electricity comes from coal, well, it does, but without trucks and diesel-powered vehicles to service the facilities, the power station can't operate. I mean, essentially everything requires liquid fuels to run in our economy. And are we at the end of world GDP? This is a graph that's showing, this is from the OECD and World Bank, that actually in 2014 GDP peaked. We've really started to, so notice this is that familiar curve again, ascend, sustain, decline. So we're just at that place right now. And that correlates beautifully, well, same shape graph. This is world hard coal production. And next year is the year that beyond which we will produce less coal every year after next year. So, you know, a lot of my friends are activists, work for, you know, operate with Friends of the Earth and other NGOs, and they're really fighting hard to end fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are coming to their end by themselves. And I don't mean they shouldn't be doing what they're doing, but this is not widely understood. And this is the reason that Hazelwood Power Station closed, was because, not because there's not coal there, but because the heat content in the coal has been declining year over year to the point where when they put it in the boilers, it wasn't producing sufficient heat. So they're now, so that was the choice to close down Hazelwood.
Just a quick question. Phil.
Yeah.
Don't they, as much as fossil fuels are becoming less available, aren't they also finding more? And that's why we have these things like people drilling in the Bight and like always looking for new places, isn't it? Because we're actually like it looks like they're declining, but then we find more.
Yeah,
Isn't that a
good
thing
question,
too?
Clary, and very current one, because there's, you know, right now there's protest movements happening to stop that project of drilling in the Bight. That's what you're referring to?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this will show you what's actually happening. The really big oil finds all happened in the 1960s. And we're still pumping from those wells now. A lot of them are in depletion. But so these are the really big finds, including our own Bass Strait oil fields. This is 2016. I didn't have a chart. This is from Bloomberg and using Wood Mackenzie data. I don't have a current one, but it's very similar. You know, 17, 18, 19 are here somewhere. And so we're not actually finding new oil fields, which is quite surprising, isn't it? And the reason we're not finding new oil fields is because oil companies know that the amount of profit that they can make from any new field is diminishing year on year. And so between 2016 and right now, there's $1 trillion. We know what $1 trillion looks like now, don't we? $1 trillion worth of capital expenditure is missing from the oil and gas industry. They didn't spend it. They needed to spend $1 trillion to find more oil and gas, and they didn't, because they know that the return on their investment is not going to be there. You know, I mean, sure, activists might say, well, it's because of all the protests and people at oil companies that don't want to have stranded assets, you know, if there's a carbon price or something. That's part of it, but the reality is that we've found the really big hydrocarbon reserves and we've exploited them mainly already. And that's good news. I think that's really good news. And this is just what's happened in Bass Strait. So this is the one-off bonanza of fossil fuels that was the enabling energy for all of the economic growth that we've had in Australia. Without liquid fuels, virtually no other, or economic growth is not possible without the growing access to liquid fuels. And that's what we've had. But as of 2000, the oil fields peaked in 1998. Annie and I were just in Sale last weekend, and you go into Sale as you drive in, there's these massive office buildings that were built by Esso. In 1998, they just walked out. They basically left town. They've been there for 30 years, and they knew that the oil field was peaking, and they've basically left town. Those offices are now the local council is occupying offices. So now oil production from that field is actually down. It's about 50,000 barrels a day. I've got a friend who works at the Longford plant, and he's actually shown me the production data. So that amazing oil field is finished. It's not producing anything. And gas from that field, oil is what comes out. It's first because it's got gas pressure behind it. The oil comes out first, and when the oil's pretty much gone, what you've got is gas. And gas is pretty useful, but even it's in decline now. And by 2021, we're going to be below. This is demand here. We're going to be below demand, which is why AGL are now setting up a gas import facility at Crib Point. Right now, they're going through the planning stages. We're going to import gas to Australia. We're the largest exporter of gas, and now we're going to import gas. Go figure. It's pretty crazy, isn't it? But anyway, so the point is these fields are in decline. Esso had to spend $2 billion on their gas plant at Longford because the gas is of such poor quality. It's got lots of CO2 and mercury in it, so they had to spend $2 billion on the plant to keep it going because they're using the dregs of what the gas supply was. And this is the other part of the story of gas and why we need to be really careful about how we use gas, is because now with Hazelwood closed, there's increasing demand for what's called peaking power, which is when the sun's not shining and the wind's not blowing and renewables are not available. We have to have gas plants that can fire up at very short notice to fill the gaps, and they are gas-powered turbines. So we really need to be careful how we use the remaining gas. I'm going to stop there. The next part of it is quite cerebral. I mean, that's probably quite cerebral, really, I suppose, for most people. But so before we do anything else, can I just ask for, if you can think of a word, just one word, to describe the feeling that you have having looked at this data. Maybe it's not new for people, but most people find it pretty new. Would anyone like to volunteer a word?
Scary?
Scary.
Yep.
Yeah.
Throaty? Is that a word?
It is now, Lucky.
Maybe throat choker.
Throaty. Yeah.
Unbalanced.
Unbalanced. Do you mean our economy, our energy situation, or?
Just kind of like that, but also, you say, oh, it's good news that there is no oil being found, so that's good, but the other side is that, we have to do something when there's no oil. We have to change, and will that be
It's
good,
changing.
or will that be bad, or...
Yeah.
So I'm not, unbalanced about, unsure, maybe,
Yeah.
something.
Unsure, yeah. Uncertain. It's very uncertain. Well, the thing I didn't say about the oil picture is that last year we burned through 35 billion barrels worth of oil. That's a big number, but think of 35 billion barrels, and we found 5. So, yeah, that's something's going to have to change, and it's going to have to change pretty soon.
Well, I've got 2 words. I'd say embarrassing. Because how do you explain that to future generations?
Yeah.
That we've just let the whole world dry.
Yeah.
And guilty.
Yeah.
And I'd like to feel a bit more optimistic.
Yeah.
But when you see it, like, you take it easy on gas, but, no matter how easy we take it, it's pretty much gone, And even the attitude of we've got to take it easy on it, like, haven't we taken enough?
Yeah. Yeah. So
Yeah.
you're feeling it, that we've created a kind of intergenerational injustice or something?
Well, not just us, but, you know, a couple of generations before us, definitely too.
Yeah.
But yeah, you think that we, in this day and age, we'd have an only, to the amount of ignorance you hear, like, oh, they'll sort it out, you know. I will go and live on Mars, and I really like that analogy with the battery, because I always think of Mars when they say, oh, you know, we can go and live on Mars, and I think, no, that's a lesson that we should be taking.
Yeah,
you
that's
know?
right. Yeah.
Because I've always, before that battery thing, I always thought as the Earth as a living organism, and like a person, if your temperature is up 2 or 3 degrees, you know, you're pretty close to death.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
people say, oh, it's a degree or so, you know, it changes 10 degrees in a few minutes.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm just trying to stay optimistic.
Yeah.
And I am, I suppose. I wouldn't be here if I wasn't. Makes
Yeah.
it lovely. But yeah. Sorry.
No, that's all right. Thank you.
It's good.
Anyone else like to share?
I think it's kind of empowering because we've got that information and like,
Yeah.
we never used, well, I never used to get told that stuff.
Yeah.
We just used to do stuff, behaviour shit.
Yeah.
Whereas in the last, I don't know, it feels like the last 10 years it's really started to shift rapidly. And that's amazing to me.
Yeah. Do you mean this kind of awareness?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Having those, like seeing these figures and having these people writing and protesting all these things that
Yeah.
are wrong in the world.
Yeah.
And having access to all these other people with the same thoughts and ideas and desires for
Yeah.
a better future. I think that's empowering. I think
Yeah.
it's scary, but the flip side is we know what's wrong and we can see a future. But yeah, like Claire said, now we have to do shit about it.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyone else?
Yeah, okay. I kind of 2 words as well. One is just like annoyed, maybe pissed off, or some of those extra words on top of that. And mainly because I've seen a bit of this when I was studying at uni, and that's almost 20 years ago now. Still same graphs, same stories. What have we done? What have I done? But also the second word is also just impatient to get on with the new future. Just let's just do it.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, so the what I find empowering is sorry, what's your name?
My name's Connor.
Connor. What Connor said was actually looking the tiger in the eye. You know, we know this, we know the reality, and now we're empowered because we can make some choices. If you really don't know the reality, well, for one thing, in some ways, I feel less anxious about the future knowing this than I did before, because I think because I've lived through this fossil fuel age, this bonanza, this party that we've had, but at some level I've had a gnawing doubt that it could really continue. Just somehow it just didn't feel like it was going to be sustainable. And I think how it operates is Carl Jung said something like, until we make the unconscious conscious, it will direct our lives and we will call it fate. So what's unconscious for most of society is that they have a fear, like I had a fear, of somehow lack in the future. That things are okay today, but what about tomorrow or next week or next month or next year or in 10 years? That unconscious fear of lack in the future eats away at us somehow. But to make that conscious, like, oh wow, to see the reality, to see, yeah, sure, there is fear there. What's fear for? Fear is to drive us into action, to create a different reality. So that's really empowering. Yeah, kind of like that's a good point. I'll just, in the bit of time we've got left, I'll just go flick through a whole lot of slides that were on here that we won't get to, but to some which point to where we might go with this. So we're going to talk about energy. We'll do this next week and what's happened with energy. Yeah, well, this is one of my key learnings is really that to proceed with a kind of loving presence into the future, that we need to be grateful, to develop our sense of gratefulness and equanimity, but above all, a sense of forgiveness, that we need to be able to forgive ourselves for our part in this story, and to forgive those people that we consider to be the perpetrators of this situation, of this vast inequality. And when we look at what's happened to the natural world, and when we look at what's happened to the world's Indigenous people, it's a tragedy. But no one intended it to happen. Somehow that this is an emergent property of civilization that found a highly concentrated form of energy and ways to use that energy to make their lives better. That was a good thing, and we need to somehow come to a place of forgiveness. We think big corporations are the problem, or big corporations are actually people behind corporations, the shareholders, the investors, there's people. Well, were those people doing the best they could? It's a good question. Were they doing the best they could? So this is one of the subjects that we'll cover next week. Yeah, so the great men of the industrial age, what was happening for them. And this is a profound book by Max Weber. I read maybe 10 years ago, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Does anyone recognise the Protestant ethic? Can anyone speak about the Protestant ethic?
I critiqued it in a church once.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. In a church?
Yeah.
Fantastic.
There was, so I used to go to church, and they were doing a sermon series on money. And I was asked as a representative of the younger cohort in the church to share my perspectives on money and stuff. And at the time, me and my partner decided we decided that we were saving money for nothing. We had no savings goals or whatever. We would just get rid of all our surplus above a certain amount that we thought was enough for an emergency.
Yeah.
Like hospitals or whatever. And so we just started giving away all of our excess money, and it turned out to be a lot, even on student wages at the time. And I kind of realised how much, our just obsession with work as sort of proof of your own worth, like the Protestant work ethic that you've got to work to be worth anything. It's just kind of pointless.
Yeah.
And I said this in the church, and got
Wow.
some very mixed responses.
That's not all what we want to do now.
You're a heretic.
Yeah.
Wow. How about that?
It was Anglican, so yeah, full-on Protestants.
Anglican. Yeah. Well, that's a really good story. Thank you for that. But the original Protestants, or we will talk about it next week, but the Calvinists, after the Reformation, that was the ethic of work. The liberation would happen through work, and the more work you did, the more liberated you would be, and so on. And it's like unexamined, and it's still there for us today, isn't it? And I mean, this guy Hans Jonas is a German philosopher whose writings gave rise to the German Greens Party, and that's his. He says this in German. It's not quite an exact translation, but this is the tragedy of the modern world: the growth of civilization and the destruction of nature go hand in hand, and how do you get away from that, and what does it mean for us, and how do we respond to that? So this is partly why I think this work's really important, that economic and energy literacy is absolutely crucial if people are going to be able to understand why they are experiencing the current reality, why we're having economic contraction, why families can't pay their mortgage, why is this happening? It's only understandable through the lens of energy